Hey guys, thanks for coming on right now and checking out this time together that we're going to have in Hebrews chapter 1. I'm really enjoying going live and recording these things and had a blast last week. And so, listen, what I want you to do is for sure in the comment sections, ask me a question or two. And listen, this week, here's my promise to you. If you say in the comment section, pray for me, and I've done this on social media before, and sometimes I've had to actually work really hard on this. But if you in the comment section write, pray for me, I will, before the Lord, I will actually take time and I will pray for you. And if it takes me 7 to 10 days or more, which sometimes it's taken depending upon the volume, I will actually get to everyone by name and I will pray for you. And I'll just ask God to bless you. You don't need to give me your prayer request or any of that. I'm just going to intercede and ask God to do great and wonderful things in your life. So here we are. I'm going to be talking about Hebrews chapter 1. As you can see on the screen, I'm Rick Soto. I pastor a wonderful church here in Solvang, California, right there. And it's a beautiful area here. And I absolutely love talking about Jesus and teaching the Word. But I have been in Hebrews chapter 1, and last week wanted to talk about the unseen world. Wanted to really kind of go there by way of introduction to help everyone understand, like, what is this book of Hebrews? The book of Hebrews, what I love about that as scripture is that you don't really need to know anything to read it. It's a beautiful literary piece. It reads clean. Every chapter just flows. You kind of get it. It has highs and real nice pacing. But it opens up clearly talking about this unseen world and what does it look like to really know that God is working in an unseen world really to us. And so that's what I was really chasing last week. And I sort of mentioned a number of scholars and thinkers who were so different. And I did that. And you want to go back. Last week was my first video. This is number 2, but we're in the same chapter, Hebrews chapter 1. So what I was chasing last week was trying to help you understand that there really is this unseen world, and through multiple layers of Jewish and Christian history, through multiple layers of academia and philosophical thought and scientific thought, and through math, people have really thought about this. Like, what does it really mean that there's actually an unseen world? And so that's what we're getting at. And chapter 1 is going to talk about angels. And the whole theme of chapter 1 is that Jesus is greater than angels. And that is a really profound statement. So today what we're going to do is we're actually going to tackle, first and foremost, chapter 1, and I'm going to go verse by verse through it. I'll read the chapter out, and then I'm going to break it down. And then next week, I'm going to do a more in-depth doctrinal study on angelology. We'll get some of it, but next week, got to really kind of chase out more in terms of what is this angel class, and what do Scripture have to say about that. And so we'll chase more of that specifically next week as we really begin to kind of, what do I want to say? Muse or chew on the cud. I guess that's what I'm trying to say about this chapter. So let's get after it right now in terms of Hebrews chapter 1. And Hebrews chapter 1 is going to start out in verse 1. I'm just going to read here. I'm actually in the ESV Bible, but any Bible will do. The best Bible is the one you read. I'll do another teaching on how Bibles are different. You might find that really fascinating. But the ESV is a literal translation, and I think it reads beautifully. So here in Hebrews chapter 1 says, long ago, and at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he created the world. You want to hang on to those thoughts about that he created the world. That's going to come up in a theme about how Jesus is actually greater than angels. So verse 3 now. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. So Jesus is actually actively holding the universe right now together. And one of the more fascinating things about like the seen and the unseen world that we have to talk about is that later in the book of Hebrews, and for sure in the book of Revelation, uh, you might think to yourself that the unseen world is less stable than this world, the physical world. And that's actually not true. The unseen world cannot be shaken. This world can be shaken really good, in which your life can be shaken, and my life can be shaken. We have here, well, I'm in California, depending upon where you're watching. So we have earthquakes. And boy, that's really something to be in a California earthquake. They're very rare. We don't have any, everyone talks about we're going to have the big one and something like that. But uh, I have a family that lives in Florida and they get hurricanes, and that's the real deal. That is real. And then those hurricanes are that. So we have weather patterns that disrupt things here. So this world actually can be shaken. The unseen world cannot. And what we're really kind of getting after is this very interesting supernatural physical dynamic thing where the unseen world, which is on the outside, but it's really just a thin removal, can actually come into the physical world. Like how does that happen? Right? And so we know certain things about mathematics that mathematical theorists like to talk about, and that is starting with the atom. And so if there's an atom, the atom is not completely filled up with substance, actually just a really small part of it. So people just muse and say, how is it possible that the unseen world can actually enter into the seen world? And I'm an unabashed Trekkie. I mean, I'm an unabashed Trekkie. I actually really love Star Trek, and I've not seen all of the series. I kind of favor the Chris Pine series and the more, last 20 years. But I just love the storyline. I grew up with that. I just loved it. Stood out. I'd really date myself. I was a boy in the 70s, and I stood in the longest line outside of Grauman's Chinese Theater, where my older brother had actually taken me to go see the premiere because we're both Trekkies, and it was just a blast. And we're around all these people dressed up. And actually, there was this really dates me. This is back when there was television, and so the evening newscast, because we got there. I think we got there somewhere at the dinner hour, and we finally got a chance to see the midnight show. So this is for 11 o'clock at night was the more common during the television era, the more common era of when you would have news. So I'll never forget her name. Her name is Cynthia Allison, and that was just who the broadcaster was. And she's going down the line. I was actually standing next to people dressed up like the whole cast. There's Klingons there, and there was a guy like dressed up like Kirk and Spock and the whole cast. And my brother and I, we're just kids. And so we're standing next to this whole cast because, we've been in a line for hours and hours and hours and hours. So of all the things, Cynthia Allison, the news reporter, comes over and puts the mic to me, right? And what's funny is look what I do with my life, right? I'm a preacher of the gospel and I talk all the time. And so she asked me to talk about the experience of that. And so anyways, on TV, and I remember being at football practice, it was the summertime, the next day, and just having a good laugh with a lot of friends. So I'm a Trekkie. So I share those details because, theorists want to think about how is it possible that Jesus or even an angel goes from the unseen world into the known world? Is it like Star Trek has this, transporter machine where the cast or the person, the character, they go into a special room and they stand on this little circular disc. There's somebody in another room, they have these dials, and then they're able to transport their body like hundreds of miles down to a planet. Right? And they can be on planet, and a lot of times in the storyline, somebody's in trouble, and so then they can kind of, get their GPS, if you will, on them, and they can be transported back up to the ship, and like that. Like, is there like a transporter machine in heaven, and so the angels stand on it, or Jesus stands on it, and they go from one world into the other? Or is it like mathematicians really theorize in terms of the idea that there's portals, and there's like loops or tunnels, kind of things that can come from one dimension into another? and simply the angelic host simply enters those doors? Or does God, by some divine will, just open up, and he just opens up the door and the whole host is there, like we see sometimes at Scripture, especially at the birth of Jesus over Christmas? And what is that like? Right? And so we have here this text, right? We've got this incredible text which is talking that Jesus, again in verse 3, he's the radiance of the glory of God, the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. Now the gospel, after making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. For to which of the angels did he ever say? So right there, the author of Hebrews is telling you, listen, I'm going to tell you exactly how Jesus is greater than angels, and I'm going to begin to kind of work through that. Hey, a big shout out to my good friends at Calvary Chapel, Rosarito. Like, I love this church. I love my buddy Mike Vincent there, Pastor Mike Vincent. Man, much love to you. And I'm excited for this conference that he's got going. It's one of the most successful, or should I say fruitful, church planters that I've ever met. His ministry is absolutely incredible. And so you can go to calvaryrosarito.com and find out about them. They're just absolutely great people. So how is it possible that happens? And so the Bible isn't clear about that, but what is clear is that Jesus is greater than an angel. He's not an angel. He's the Son of God, and Jesus is God. Now, for the rest of the chapter, Hebrews is actually going to kind of really go through a true methodology of the best way and to understand them. There's going to be 7 verses. And there's going to be cross references into the Old Testament by which we can understand and know what is actually being spoken of. And so the first thing you need to know is that Jesus is greater really by way of title. So Jesus is not eternally the Son. Jesus is actually Yahweh. Jesus becomes the Son at what we call Christmas. That's called the first Advent. That's when he really becomes the Son. But he is eternally God. He's Yahweh. He's actually Yahweh. And we'll talk more about this next week as we really get into the nature of angels. For verse 5, for to which of the angels did he ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? Or again, I will be to him, now look at this, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. So the cross-reference there is actually out of the second Psalm, verse 7, is where that reference is, that you are my son and I have begotten you. So Jesus, like I said, is not eternally the son. He is actually eternally Yahweh. Now you might say, okay, now how do we know that? Like, how do we know that could be true? All right, so what we want to do right now is we actually want to evaluate something that I had the pleasure, I'm back at school and really enjoying pursuing some advanced a divinity degree in basic Bible study, really, and I'm really having a lot of fun doing that. And so I ended up writing a paper on Jesus's I am statements. And so let me just give these to you. This is actually right there with how we understand that Jesus is Yahweh. So in John chapter 6, verse 35, Jesus will say that I am actually the bread of life. So that I am statement will be repeated a number of times. And there's a lot more in the Gospel of John. I mean, it's really like a secret code. But this first one's important to understand. Jesus will say that I am the bread of life. In other words, I am Yahweh. I am actually Yahweh, the bread of life. John chapter 8, verse 12, he says, I am the light of the world. So Yahweh is the light of the world. And Jesus there is absolute equation, one-on-one, one-to-one, like this, like an equation where they come together, where he is actually saying truly that he is God. One that really got the cackles of the religious Jews at the time is found later in John chapter 8, verse 58, where Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. One that we all love in John chapter 10, he's going to say it twice in verse 7 and verse 9. Jesus is going to say that I am the door. And then he's going to repeat this in the same chapter, John chapter 10. He's going to say it 3 different times and in a couple different ways, specifically in verse 11 and 14, he's going to say, I am the good shepherd. So Yahweh is actually a shepherd. He's the bread of life. He's the light of the world. He is the door. He's the good shepherd. A chapter later, in John chapter 11, verse 25, Jesus is going to say, I'm the resurrection and the life. And in John chapter 14, verse 6, I am the way and the truth and the life. And in John chapter 15, I am the true vine. So these are the ones that are most popularly known and kind of understood that way, where Jesus is saying, I am. That same I am that Moses met in the wilderness, in the bush, I am that. I am actually now the fulfillment of that. And I have come at the term for Christmas, the first Advent, and I'm actually here now. That's who I am. So these I am statements are absolute proof that Jesus is God, that he's the Messiah, and that he actually has always been eternally God. He became a son at Christmas. Now, related to Jesus being Yahweh, there's something that I kind of want to take you through. I think you're going to really enjoy this. So in Judaism, and this would be, kind of like maybe 200 years or so, 300 years before Jesus, all the way through him to 100 years afterwards, there's something called second Yahweh. Now this is fascinating. I mean, if you're a Bible geek, you're going to actually love this, where the rabbis began to think about the Old Testament text and began to say, there really does seem to be, if we're really being honest, there really seems to be a second Yahweh in Scripture. I mean, we know that there's only one God. So we know that monotheism is true. There's only one God. But there definitely seems to be two Yahwehs. There seems to be an invisible Yahweh, but then there is one that really kind of comes and manifests himself here on earth as a second Yahweh. So let's run with that. So Christians call this a theophany. That is an Old Testament appearance of Jesus. But Second Temple Judaism, that is the academic term for the time period surrounding Jesus. So that would really be 200 to 300 years before Jesus. Kind of depends who you read and who dates at, all the way to about 100 years after the resurrection. And so rabbis would say that there is actually a second Yahweh. And so here's the key phrase that I want you to kind of see. I'm going to go to Exodus, and I'm going to go to Exodus chapter 23. So this is a cross reference. I want you to see Yahweh here. I want you to see how Jesus is Yahweh, and this is why Jesus is actually greater than Jesus, actually going to be greater than an angel. And I'm going to be in verse 20 if I can find it here. Okay, here it is. Okay, so Exodus chapter 23, verse 20. Here we go, right? Behold, the text says, I send an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place I have prepared. Right? This is the entire Exodus story, right? This is let my people go time. And in verse 21 it says, pay careful attention to him. Why? Obey his voice. You want to really kind of dig in on that. Obey his voice. Do not, the text says, do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgression. Why is that? Because he's going to say, for my name is in him. And this idea that this name of God, Yahweh, is in him, and that there's this power coming from him, the rabbis would begin to say, there's got to be a second Yahweh out there. There's some sort of manifestation. Verse 22, but if you carefully obey his voice and do all that I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies. In other words, if you obey this second Yahweh, I will take care of your enemies, and they will be my enemies, and I will be an adversary to your adversaries. And then lastly, now here in verse 23, when my angel goes before you to bring you to the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Jebusites, right? I'll remove them. So it's a powerful statement. And this is one example of the rabbis really trying to figure out, there is this invisible Yahweh, and then there's like a Yahweh who shows up. And when he shows up, wow, he's going to take care of business. And we like that Yahweh, that's for sure. So the second reference I would give you in terms of the Old Testament, again, to show you that Jesus is Yahweh, is equated with Yahweh, the I am statements. Christians know this, they call it a theophany, but the rabbis actually called it second Yahweh. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Is there's the second one, a lot of people need to love this story. This is actually in Joshua. And this is Joshua chapter 5, and it's just such a wonderfully bold and dare I say, like really strong and masculine text. It's in verse 13. In Joshua chapter 5, the text is going to say, and I'll read it right now. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And when Joshua went to him, he said, "Are you for us? Or are you for our adversaries?" I mean, that's a bold move. I mean, but Joshua wants to know, man, do I got to get rid of you? Or are you for me? Now watch what happens. He said, "No, I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." And Joshua, the text says, he just falls on his face, which is a really good move. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshiped him and said, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals for the place off your feet, for the place you're standing is holy ground." And Joshua did so. Now listen, you don't need to be a Bible scholar to sort of really understand when was the last time you saw that kind of imagery of, hey, take off your feet, you're on holy ground. And that's when Yahweh was speaking through the burning bush. And he tells Moses, take off your feet for you're on holy ground. And now Yahweh is going to show up. But now there's this physical manifestation of Yahweh. We're not talking about it through the burning bush, where now there's this physical manifestation of Yahweh, that second Yahweh that the rabbis begin to say, you know, there is like a figure here that just seems to leave heaven, manifest on earth. We don't know how that happens. And when he shows up, really incredible things start to happen. And so this is actually a theophany. It's an appearance of Jesus. And you can really understand how they would be sort of like trying to figure that out. Now, here's what actually really happened. About 100 years after the resurrection, as you would imagine, I mean, just a revival amongst Jews becoming what we would call born-again Christians. And they would know themselves that way as well. So they're becoming born-again Christians. These Jews are coming to faith. Left and right, all over the world. And so rabbis, frankly, got sick of it. And what they did is they began to say, okay, well, those rabbis who really taught about that there's actually two Yahwehs, this visible and this one physical who comes and manifests himself, but there's one God, they're going to say that's just complete and total heresy. I can't believe we ever believed that. There's no way. And they actually just shut down that entire conversation. Now, when I'm not a scholar on this, so I'm not gonna do what some YouTubers do, where they just went to Google or they just went to the AI and have I read the source material and then they're gonna quote this and quote this person and all of that. Listen, I know a little bit about a guy named by Philo of Alexander and a little bit of what he said, but I'm not a scholar. I'm not deep on that side of the street. I know enough to know what the rabbis were some consistently trying to talk about related to the second Yahweh. But here's the thing, 100 years after Jesus, they just got sick of it and they just began to say, look, it doesn't exist. And that, if you were to like take time to think about that, that's sort of cousin to the church today. We have this debate about the Holy Spirit. It's called cessationism or continuationism. So what does that really mean? Okay, well, cessationism is the idea that the supernatural gifts of the Spirit, at least some of them or all of them, just don't exist anymore. And that is because the quote unquote Bible canon is closed. And then there's those that say, no, the closed canon actually says just the opposite, and that there's a continuation of the gifts of the Spirit. And, we don't know how all the results work. Like, how does God heal the answer to one prayer off of another? We don't know that. We just know that we're just supposed to pray for sick people. We know that the elders are supposed to come around, according to James, and anoint people with oil and pray for them that are sick. And those prayers made in faith will make that person well. It's actually the elders' faith there that is actually supposed to be operating and doing positive work for somebody who's weak. So we think, and I tend to think, that the Second Temple debate that about Judaism and these two Yahwehs that was going on at that time, I tend to think it's like that. It's like what happened 100 years after Jesus. They just say, hey, there's just no more supernatural work. Like, nah, that we had that whole wrong. And they began to try and shut down that conversation in that way. So one thing you have to know as we kind of go back now to the book of Hebrews, and as we look at this, is that the way that Jesus is addressed here, no angel is ever addressed that way. When the text says, "For to which of the angels did God ever say, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you'?" The answer is none. That never took place. Not at all. I mean, it just never, ever took place, which is why we can say Jesus is not eternally the Son. Jesus is eternally Yahweh. He's always been God. So there's no way that he could ever be addressed like an angel in that manner. Or again, when he says, "I will be to him a father and he shall be to me a son," that was never, ever said of the angels. Jesus is actually greater than the angels. There's another reference here that I like under this category of Jesus being eternally Yahweh, and it's actually out of second. It's referenced here. "I will be to my father." That is actually out of 2 Samuel, chapter 7, verse 14. That's what's being referenced there, and God is listening to David say that David saying, "I want to build you a house, Lord. I want to build you a house of worship where you can dwell." Meaning this like little tent that's kind of ridiculous. And God says to him, "What you think I'm going to abide in man's work? You think a house out of cedar is actually suitable for me? No, I don't." But God loved what David was trying to do, and so He allows it and ordains it. And the promise that is given to David there is that Jesus, the Messiah, the second Yahweh, to use that rabbinic terminology, will actually eternally sit on your throne, David. So your legacy is going to be secure now in me. I see your heart, despite your failings. I see your heart, and you're now actually going to be able to know that promise, and it will be fulfilled. Incredible. And that's what we have at Christmas, and we have at Easter is a fulfillment of that promise. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 14. All right, let's take a few minutes and now continue on. Look at the next verse is going to say this. We're going to look at that Jesus is greater by receiving worship. So the text is going to say, again, when he says to his firstborn, brings his firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels, worship him. So let's check. The phrase again is really, that is really an interesting, thought related to commentators saying, wow, what does it mean that it's again? When he says that, the word again is sometimes considered, and I kind of lean this way, that it's probably a foreshadowing to the second coming. This is probably again, he's going to be in this place, only Jesus came humbly at what we call the first advent in the Virgin Mary and the manger and the stable and all of that. But at the second coming, he's coming as a warrior. He went to the cross on a little bit of a donkey, right? This little animal of a donkey, but he is actually coming back on a war horse. That's all related to the second coming. So you just know that that's kind of debated back and forth. I lean that way. I think that's actually what it's saying. That's that phrase again in the text. And firstborn is not, as we would think, like, I have several sons and I have a firstborn. This is actually related to a title. It's actually a title of prestige and premier to be considered the firstborn in that way. And 1 Peter chapter 1 and 10 and 12, Peter's going to actually have a conversation. He's going to say, you know what, there's really a time period where angels were actually trying to look in and see when was the Messiah going to arrive? When was Jesus going to actually finally leave heaven? And angels, the text says there in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 10 through 12, angels were actually looking, trying to really see when is the time. So basically the angelic host is like going, is it now? Is he going to come now? Is he going to come now? Is he going to come now? Oh, he's not coming right now. No, wait, is he coming now? I mean, they were actually looking to see when was the day in which Jesus would actually come. But we have to know the text is actually quoting Psalm 97, verse 7, because Jesus is greater than angels because he receives worship. I mean, actually receives worship. In Psalm 97, verse 7 says, let all the angels of God worship him. So let me share this. You're going to actually want to hear this. It's a little bit of a dated story. But it's true. It's actually a wonderful time period of some years ago when two elderly ladies that were Jehovah's Witnesses actually showed up at my door. They knocked on the door and they asked if I had time. And I don't know, maybe I had eaten some bad Chinese, or I had a quesadilla with some sauce or something like that. But normally I just will be gracious at the door and not invite them in, because I just don't have the patience anymore, because no matter what I say or do is ever going to work. For some reason, I let these two old ladies in, and they were charming, and we actually had a really good conversation. Frankly, they were actually really sharp, and I enjoyed the banter a lot. And so what started to happen over the period of about 6 months is they would come back about every 2 weeks. And since I was much younger than them, they would try to find some guy like my age or that would kind of relate to me in their fellowship. He didn't ever have much to say. These two ladies were chatty Cathys, but it was a nice attempt. And so in this one moment, the elder of the two, she had some training materials. So she had this book, relatively thin, and really hardback cover. Just had some press words into it, said like training. And she said, look, normally I would not do this. I'm so liking our conversation. At the very back of this book, it has a lot of explanations of things that you, I think, would like to read. And this is one of our training manuals. So it actually really answers more in depth than I ever could a lot of questions you have. I would like to gift it to you, and you can have you could read our source material. Oh, well, that's great. So I don't know, it stayed on my bedside for a couple of weeks. I finally began to kind of peruse it and look at it. And I began to realize that it actually was fascinating, because what I was reading like their evangelistic training manual, and that evangelistic training manual from the Jehovah's Witnesses was talking about how to avoid certain traps in their logic. And it actually said things that we don't have answers to. So in that training manual, it said things we don't have an answer to was actually found right here in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 6, when it says, and let all the angels of God worship him. Because if you cross-reference that with Jesus, where Jesus is actually in his temptation account in Matthew chapter 4, and in his temptation account, Jesus is going to say that you are actually only to worship God. So when you put those two together, you realize that the angels are actually saying that Jesus is actually Yahweh, Jesus is actually God. And so this lady from the Jehovah's Witnesses gave me actually in her training manual the very answer that I was always kind of wondering, why do you guys think this, and what are you trying to stay away from? And that is it. And if you were to actually pick up a Jehovah's Witness Bible or some materials, what you're going to realize that they don't use the word worship. They use a very old English word called obedience. And when you just get into the weeds of that, that's just that actually is just a word that actually means worship. And it's just so old that people don't really know that. So anyway, I ended with those ladies on really good terms. And I never saw them again. And I held on to that training manual forever. And it was so fascinating. To this day, it's actually served me very, very well. But Jesus is actually, according to this text, receiving worship. The angels of God are actually worshiping him. And as you're noticing, there's 7 cross references here in this chapter. There's 7 different verses that are being given as Old Testament examples to show you that Jesus is actually greater than an angel. Next is actually in verse 7, and Jesus is actually greater because he actually is the creator. So of the angels, he said, he makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire. And that text there, which is found out of Psalm 104, verse 4, is actually indicative of the fact that the angels are actually doing his business and that he actually is the creator. And we know from Colossians chapter 1, verse 16, which says Jesus is actually the one who actually was the one who was creating everything that we see and is unseen. Angels actually follow the divine decrees of Jesus. That's what this is referring to. He makes his angels winds, and the ministers are actually his flames of fires. Yahweh gives a decree, and they actually have to follow it, and creation has to follow it because Jesus is actually that creator. In verse 8 and 9, Jesus is actually greater than an angel by being the creator. He's actually greater by being part on the eternal throne. And so in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8, the scripture is going to say, but of the Son, he says, that's a reference to Jesus, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. So he's saying that Jesus actually now has a throne. And that throne is actually one that he will sit on. So you can see the logic. Okay, well, you're going to fulfill and sit on David's throne. But now for eternity, that's actually been true. And the Father gives testimony here about the Son. That's actually what's going on here. The Father is actually giving testimony of the Son that Jesus is God and that his throne is eternal. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond all of your companions. They're quoting this quote here is from Psalm 45, verse 7. It actually is an indication of Jesus' motivation. So this is actually more true, when I think about witnessing more and sharing with 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds. There seems to be in the current generation, which I love, by the way. I just think a fantastic generation. And I believe God's doing great things and actually setting up this generation for mighty works of God and big wins. I know, like a lot of youth, they feel like, oh no, everything's against us. I can't get housing. I can't maybe get jobs, all of that. Listen, I would tell everybody in their 20s or 30s, don't despair. God is with you. Your generation is going to do great and mighty things. But related to that, in terms of the generations that we're talking about here, that generation has things that actually people will sort of call into question. What was Jesus's motivation? We see here that Jesus's motivation was loved. You've actually loved righteousness. You've actually loved righteousness. So Jesus' motivation was exactly that, to actually love righteousness and do right. So Jesus is greater by eternal throne, and he's also going to be greater by the nature of his existence. And what will be quoted here will be Psalm 102 and ultimately Psalm 110. And so in verse 10, it says, you, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment, like a robe, you will roll them up, and like a garment they will be changed, but you are the same, and your years will have no end. And I'll just finish out verse 13. And to which of the angels has he ever said, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool of your feet? Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation? So he is greater. Jesus is greater by nature and by existence. He's actually eternally God. And he's greater by way of conclusion. Psalm 110 is what has been quoted there at the end. And so Jesus' destiny is actually that every single person would know that he is actually God, and that they could actually come to know God in that great and wonderful and true and personal way. All right, so what I wanted to do in this session was get that out of the way. I wanted to lay the foundation. That what is the book of Hebrews saying? And remember, I introduced this study by saying that Hebrews, this book that we're looking at, is actually curriculum. It's church planting curriculum. I mean, that's what I actually really believe it is. And I believe it is actually Paul's teachings that were written down by his students, by which he actually edited. This was so that all those churches can be planted in what we now know as modern day Turkey, or even ancient Greece, and in many, many other places. You wanted to train pastors, you wanted to train missionaries, you wanted to equip men and women for gospel ministry. He had a nerve center there at Ephesus. He taught in a school called Tyrannus. Right? So I believe that what we're looking at is actually this church planting curriculum. And these churches are out in these places. Some are urban, some are country. And people have these questions, and if you're a Jew, you have much of a Jewish background or not, it's a natural question to ask. Who is Jesus? And is he merely an angel, right? Is he merely an angel? Is he like an angel guy or something like that? No, and he's actually incredible, because he's actually Yahweh. There's one last thought. I'll wind this down maybe as we sort of, kind of think about this. You want to say, okay, well, listen, Rick, tell me a little bit more about this, second Yahweh concept, right? So I try to introduce that to you so that you would have a category in your mind that the Trinity is not new. And it's not new, it's not man-made, because that's who God is. One God, three persons, one God, three persons, right? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but one God. And so there was something right after the resurrection that you're going to probably find very interesting. If you want to reference, there's a scholar that I like. He went home to be with the Lord very early, named Larry Hurtado. Larry Hurtado was a fascinating scholar. Really wrote some robust things. And towards the end of his life, he actually got sick with cancer, I believe. And he definitely was a scholar. He wrote for scholars. He did not write for a popular audience. You need some academic training to sort of follow him. But really, at the end of his life, I could tell that he wanted to write something. I'll say as a last will and testimony, because he would create some theologies and had some things thinking, and he's trying to help bring some thoughts together. I'll bypass all of that, but he writes a book called Destroyer of the Gods, and you can get it on Amazon. And it's still not the easiest read per se, but if you want to go for it, you can. And so he introduces that concept. He's one of the person that helps us understand, how the Trinity became known as a terminology because it always existed. He introduces something called Binitarianism. So Binitarianism is that second Yahweh. That's just really fascinating. We're talking about, this is the early church. Jesus is resurrected 33 AD. And we're talking in 43 AD, and 53 AD, and 63 AD. We're talking before Paul even gets saved. And then we're talking about before Paul even becomes an apostle. Like what I'm about to say is true. The early church is getting together and they're worshiping Jesus. And they're worshiping God as Father. And they know that they're one. Right? They just, and they don't really care. They're just too busy. Frankly, they're just too busy soaking in the joy of it all. They're having a great time soaking in the power of it. So it's called Binitarianism. And I just put that there as a category for you to understand that the second Yahweh is really interesting that the rabbis were still thinking about that. And that the early church said, well, we just know that Jesus is actually connected to the Father as one Yahweh. And then later on, the sort of like terminology of Trinity would actually get formalized. But it would start right here with the understanding that Jesus is actually God and that Jesus is actually greater than the angels. Listen, my friends, here's what I want you to do. No matter whether you're seeing this live or you're getting it later, you write down in the comment section, pray for me. And I'm going to take time and I'm actually going to really pray for you. And I'm so grateful to be able to share with you the truth of God's word and go through these things. Listen, friends, be blessed in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, and I'll see you next week.